Something is happening south of the border that the mainstream media isn't giving you the full picture on, and it directly affects you. A nuclear alert in Mexico isn't just a regional headline, it's a signal. It's the kind of event that, when you trace it back through the layers, the geopolitical pressures, the supply chain vulnerabilities, the power structures quietly competing for dominance in Latin America, tells you something much larger is moving underneath the surface. We live in a world where the United States and its southern neighbor share nearly 2,000 miles of border, interlocked economies, energy grids, and security dependencies. When a nuclear incident, whether it's a radiation leak, a lost radioactive source, or a facility compromise, occurs in Mexican territory, the fallout, literally and figuratively, does not respect that borderline. And here's what most people aren't asking. Why now? Who benefits from the silence around this? And what does this tell us about where global power is actually shifting? Stay with me, because this one matters. To really understand what a nuclear alert in Mexico means for you sitting here in the United States, you have to first understand the geography of vulnerability. Mexico is not some distant country on the other side of the world. It shares nearly 2,000 miles of border with the American Southwest. Its Gulf Coast sits just across the water from Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. The two countries share aquifers, river systems, prevailing wind patterns, and one of the most economically intertwined bilateral relationships on the planet. So when something goes wrong, when a nuclear alert gets issued, when a radioactive source goes missing, when a reactor facility experiences what officials call an orange alert, you are not watching a foreign story. You are watching a story that is at minimum partially yours. And here is what the mainstream conversation consistently gets wrong. It treats every nuclear incident in Mexico as a standalone event. A truck gets stolen carrying a cobalt-60 radiotherapy device. They find it in a field 3 days later. The news cycle moves on. A reactor in Veracruz triggers emergency alerts multiple times in a single year. Officials say everything is fine, and the American media barely notices. But if you look at these events not as isolated accidents, but as symptoms of a deeper systemic failure, and then you place that systemic failure inside the larger geopolitical and economic pressures currently reshaping North America, you start to see something that demands your full attention. Let's go back to December 2013 because this incident is the template for understanding everything that has happened since. A white Volkswagen truck was stolen at a gas station in Tepojaco, in the state of Hidalgo. That truck was carrying a radiotherapy machine from a hospital in Tijuana, headed to a radioactive waste storage facility. Inside that machine was a Category 1 cobalt-60 source, the most dangerous classification the International Atomic Energy Agency uses for radioactive materials. Category 1 means that if you are close enough to it, unshielded for a matter of hours, you will die. That is not an exaggeration. That is the official IAEA designation. The thieves, who by all accounts simply wanted the truck and had no idea what was inside, opened the container. They were exposed. Mexican hospitals were immediately put on alert to watch for radiation sickness. The source was eventually recovered in a field, but the container was already empty. The damage to those who opened it was already done. Now, most people heard that story as a crime story, a theft, a lucky recovery. But what I want you to notice is the infrastructure failure that made the entire incident possible in the first place. A hospital in Tijuana had a decommissioned radiotherapy machine sitting in storage, and the plan was to transport it across thousands of miles of Mexican highway in a single commercial truck with inadequate security. No military escort, no real-time tracking protocol that functioned properly. No enforcement mechanism that would have prevented a truck driver from stopping at a gas station in one of the most trafficked carjacking corridors in central Mexico. The system failed not because someone did something dramatically wrong. The system failed because the baseline level of nuclear security infrastructure in Mexico was, and continues to be, dangerously inadequate relative to the amount of radioactive material that actually moves through the country on any given day. And then you go back further to 1984 and you realize this is not a new problem, it's a chronic one. In Ciudad Juarez, a private hospital purchased a radiotherapy device, could not staff it properly, had it dismantled, and somehow allowed the cobalt-60 pellets inside it to end up in a junkyard. Those pellets were then melted into steel alongside scrap metal and turned into rebar. That contaminated rebar was distributed across 17 Mexican states and into several cities in the United States. Approximately 4,000 people were exposed to radiation. Some of that rebar ended up in buildings. The radioactive waste from that incident was stored outdoors for years without shielding in the Sierra de Nombre de Dios. And as recently as 2004, 20 years after the initial incident, independent analysis found that radiation levels in the storage area were still alarmingly high. This is not ancient history. This is a pattern of institutional failure that runs in a direct line to today. Now let's talk about Laguna Verde, because this is where the story gets genuinely alarming for anyone paying attention to the structural risks. Laguna Verde is Mexico's only nuclear power plant. It sits on the Gulf Coast in Veracruz, and it runs on two General Electric boiling water reactors, the same reactor design family that was operating at Fukushima Daiichi when the 2011 disaster occurred. Unit 1 began operation in 1990, and Unit 2 came online in 1995. In 2024, Mexico's Nuclear Safety Commission renewed the operating license for Unit 2, extending its life all the way to 2055. Let that sink in for a moment. A boiling water reactor that first came online in 1995, built with technology from the previous generation, is now licensed to operate for 6 more decades. And the entire time it has been running, there has been a persistent, documented pattern of safety concerns that the official narrative consistently downplays. Internal reports from Laguna Verde have described fuel leaks, diesel spills classified as unusual events, reactor mechanisms activating without proper safety gates in place, and multiple orange-level alerts across a span of just a few months. A nuclear engineer named Salas, who worked within the system and understood it from the inside, publicly stated that there was an imminent nuclear safety crisis and challenged officials to a public debate. The utility that operates Laguna Verde, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, or CFE, responded in the way that utilities and governments always respond when they do not want to have a real conversation about risk. They said everything was fine, and the international press moved on. But here is what you need to understand about Laguna Verde's location. It sits on the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is essentially a shared body of water for the United States and Mexico. The Gulf Stream, the prevailing current systems, the atmospheric patterns that govern where weather moves, they do not recognize national sovereignty. A serious radioactive release at Laguna Verde would not stay in Veracruz. It would move. It would move into the Gulf, and depending on weather conditions, it could reach the Texas coast, the Louisiana coast, the Florida coast, the fishing communities, the tourism economies, the coastal ecosystems that millions of Americans depend on. All of that sits downstream of Laguna Verde in more ways than one. Now here is the geopolitical layer that almost no one is talking about. Mexico is under enormous economic and political pressure right now. The relationship between Washington and Mexico City has been increasingly transactional and tense, particularly around trade, tariffs, immigration enforcement, and the fentanyl crisis. The Trump administration has put significant pressure on Mexico to deliver results on border security and drug trafficking. Meanwhile, China has been methodically expanding its economic presence in Mexico for years, building manufacturing facilities, deepening supply chain relationships, and positioning itself as an alternative partner at a time when Mexico-US relations are strained. This is not speculation. This is the documented trajectory of Chinese economic strategy in Latin America, and Mexico is one of the most important nodes in that strategy precisely because of its proximity to the American market. What does any of this have to do with nuclear safety? Everything, actually. When a country is under economic stress, when its government is juggling multiple competing pressures and relationships, when its institutional capacity is being stretched thin, nuclear safety infrastructure is one of the first things that gets quietly deprioritized, not maliciously, not with dramatic announcements, just quietly, through budget cuts, through delayed maintenance cycles, through regulatory agencies that are nominally independent but practically understaffed, through a culture of official reassurance that prioritizes perception management over honest risk assessment. We have seen this dynamic play out in country after country. It played out in Ukraine before Chernobyl. It played out in Japan before Fukushima. The institutional pressures that lead to catastrophic nuclear failures are not mysterious. They are predictable. They follow recognizable patterns. And when you look at Mexico right now, you can see several of those patterns converging simultaneously. There is also the question of nuclear material security in a country where organized crime has achieved a level of territorial and operational sophistication that rivals the state itself in certain regions. The Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, these are not street gangs. These are organizations with logistics networks, financial systems, and operational intelligence that would be the envy of many second-tier militaries. They control transportation corridors. They have people inside the legitimate economy, including in transportation, logistics, and yes, in some cases, inside government regulatory structures. When a radioactive source moves through Mexico, and they move regularly, because Hospitals use them because industrial facilities use them, because the mining and oil industries use them. It moves through terrain where these organizations have significant operational presence. The 2013 theft was opportunistic. The thieves wanted the truck. But the next theft does not have to be opportunistic. And that possibility, that radioactive material could be acquired deliberately by an organization with the resources and motivation to weaponize it, is a scenario that American national security planners think about a great deal, even if they do not talk about it publicly. The deeper issue here is one of geopolitical morality and responsibility. The United States has, for decades, operated on the assumption that Mexico's internal governance failures were Mexico's problem to solve. But that assumption was always somewhat convenient rather than accurate, and it is becoming less defensible by the day. The United States helped design and supply the nuclear technology that operates in Mexico. American companies have sold radioactive medical equipment to Mexican hospitals. American regulatory frameworks have cross-border notification responsibilities that are only as good as the institutional relationships and information-sharing agreements that support them. The IAEA exists to provide international coordination on exactly these issues, but the IAEA is also only as effective as the political will of member states to be transparent, and political will has a way of evaporating when transparency is inconvenient. What would genuine responsibility look like here? It would look like the United States taking a proactive and collaborative approach to nuclear security in Mexico that goes well beyond the current framework. It would mean serious investment in helping Mexico upgrade the security protocols around radioactive material transport. It would mean genuine diplomatic engagement around the aging Laguna Verde facility. Not lecturing, but actually partnering on safety upgrades, on regulatory capacity building, on emergency response planning that treats the two countries as the integrated risk environment they actually are. It would mean being honest with the American public about the fact that nuclear risk does not stop at national borders and that the security of communities in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, to say nothing of Gulf Coast states, is directly connected to what happens with nuclear infrastructure on the Mexican side of the line. Instead, what we get is a system that responds to crises after they happen, issues alerts, recovers sources when it gets lucky, and then returns to a default posture of official reassurance. The Ciudad Juarez incident happened, the 2013 Huipoxtla theft happened, the Laguna Verde orange alerts happened, and the underlying conditions that made each of those events possible, the inadequate security protocols, the aging infrastructure, the underfunded regulatory agencies, the corruption vulnerabilities, the absence of a serious long-term nuclear waste management plan, those conditions are still in place. They have not been meaningfully addressed. They are being managed, which is a very different thing from being solved. The world is restructuring right now in ways that are genuinely historic. Supply chains are being reorganized, military alliances are being renegotiated. The balance of economic and technological power between the United States, China, Russia, and the emerging economies is shifting in real time. In that environment, every piece of critical infrastructure, including nuclear infrastructure, becomes more strategically significant and more strategically vulnerable. Mexico sits at the intersection of all of these forces. It borders the world's largest economy. It is being courted by China as a manufacturing hub. It is under pressure from Washington on multiple fronts simultaneously. Its internal security environment is compromised in specific and well-documented ways. And it is operating aging nuclear infrastructure without a permanent waste storage solution and with a safety culture that has, at multiple documented junctures, prioritized official reassurance over transparent risk management. That is the full picture. Not a panic, not a headline designed to make you afraid and move on, a real, structural analysis of interconnected risks that directly affect you, your family, your community, and the country you live in. The nuclear story in Mexico is not a foreign policy curiosity. It is a domestic concern that just happens to have an international origin, and if the people who run this country were being fully straight with you about it, that is exactly how they would be framing it.